Welcome back. In part 2 of how to create a non-stretch cover for your dress form, I'm going to show you how to drape the upper bodice pieces. And what I'm talking about is the center front above the empire waist and the side front above the empire waist, and then the center front and back above the empire waist in the back. And because my dress form is fairly symmetrical, I'm just going to work with half the dress form. Again, if you have a custom dress form and you have asymmetry to your body, you may want to drape all the sections individually, because remember, the goal of this cover is to fit onto this dress form super tight like a scuba suit. So we're going to start with these upper pieces, and just as a little spoiler, this is harder to do because we're dealing with the curve of the bust in these sections. So if you follow along with me in part 2 and you've got it and it's good, you're going to do the same steps to drape the lower pieces. I'm going to show how to do that in part 3, but if you feel like you've got it down pat and you don't need to watch me do it, you're just going to follow these exact same steps. So the first thing we want to do is prepare our fabric. Now, draping is the process of putting a piece of fabric on a dress form, smoothing it on to create the shape of the piece we want. So you want to use a piece of fabric that's big enough to cover the entire section you're working with, but not so big that you have a ton of extra fabric that you end up trimming and wasting, and having a piece that's way too big can get a little bit cumbersome. So it's better to have a piece that's pretty close to the size that you need. So I measured from my shoulder to my empire waist, and that was 15 inches. So I'm going to cut a piece of fabric that's 18 inches long, and I've already done that. You can see that here. And I'm just going to go ahead and give it a light press. So the other thing is, we've got the length we want now. I'm going to cut it to the width I need. The widest part of the center front is 5 inches wide. So I'm going to cut my section about 8 inches. And to cut it, I'm snipping and ripping. I snipped and ripped a 1/2 yard piece off of, the big piece that I have. So again, I'm going to just use my scissors and I'm going to snip and rip this. So the reason why you want to snip and rip is because when you're ripping muslin, it's ripping along the grain of the fabric. And the cool thing is, after you've ripped a piece to get it the approximate size you need, what you can do is give it a quick press to smooth it out. Then fold it in half and make sure all the torn edges match each other. Now, my muslin is a very nice quality high count muslin, and it's on grain because my cut edges are matching. But if you fold yours and it's a little bit askew like this, you can true that up or put it back on grain by stretching the fabric on the bias. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to turn it like this, and you'd want to stretch across each other like this on the bias and put your muscle into it. Really be a little bit mean to it. Give it a little press and try it again. If it lines up or if it's closer, you're stretching it in the right direction. If stretching it this way made it worse, go ahead and turn it around and stretch it this way. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it once in each direction because mine is already straight. But you can tell if you're stretching it in the right direction because when you fold it up again, it should be better or even. So if it got worse, just go in the opposite, start at the opposite corner. See, mine is really nicely on grain. The next step is, because we're working with the center front, I am going to fold the center front edge up 1 inch. And to use a quick, use a ruler as a quick guideline, I'm just going to use my clear grid ruler and fold it up so that the salvage edge is at 1 inch. And then I'm just going to push this away and give it a press, and then I'll test it. I'll measure again just to make sure that I have an even inch here. Okay, so that's good. All right, so I folded that up. right, so the next step is I want to draw a horizontal balance line on the fabric that corresponds with the horizontal balance line across my bust span. So looking at my dress form, I know that this line is approximately 3 inches from the base of the section. So I'm going to measure up about 5 inches to give myself a little bit of room. And I'm going to draw a horizontal line, which will become the horizontal balance line for this pattern piece. Now, I'm not going to use this ruler. Instead, I'm going to use my L-shaped ruler. And the cool thing about this is if I line this up right with the center front edge, I know that along this direction it will be perfectly square and perpendicular from my center front. So I also know that this horizontal balance line I'm drawing will be parallel to the floor. So that's our next step. Now, if you don't have a square ruler like this, you can use a 6-inch quilting ruler. Just line up either the edge of it or one marking in along that center front edge like this, and then just draw along the bottom. So that's how we're going to finish preparing the fabric. All right, so in this case, I'm going to use my ballpoint pen. All right, now this piece is ready to use to drape our center front. Let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to start by pinning the fabric onto the dress form, lining up that horizontal balance line and the center front edge. So first I'll just put a pin here to hold it at center front. Then I'm going to peek under here and make sure I'm lining it up along that horizontal balance line. And I'm going to put a pin across here, you know, somewhere in the middle, just to hold it on the line. Then I'm going to smooth it up to the top, lining up that center front edge with the center front edge or the center front line on the dress form. And I'll pin it right below or right at the neckline. Okay, and so this is what it looks like now. Okay. So then what I'm going to do is, you can see here, I need the fabric down here to get to my shoulder, but this is a little bit too much. So I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to give this corner of the fabric a little bit of a haircut, like that. And then I'm going to clip down towards my neckline edge a little bit. And what that allows me to do is, it allows me to smooth the fabric over the shoulder to create a nice smooth, you know, to get this fabric nice and smooth. Now, one of the things that can be a mistake that you can make is smoothing too hard. This really takes a gentle touch. Okay, so you just want to gently smooth it. And once I've got it nice and smooth, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a clip over here just to release the fabric on this side too. And then I'm going to pin up right at the end of my shoulder seam at the base of my neck here. And then I'm going to pin along the shoulder seam right at the princess seam line. So I've got the base of the neck and where the princess seam line starts. Then I'm just gonna, and then I'm gonna start back down here, and I'm just gonna smooth this until it's nice and smooth. And I only need to smooth it to that princess line, which is right here. So I'm just gonna put a pin there, and then we're gonna smooth it off to the side, you know, making sure that we're keeping all of this nice and straight too. I don't want to pull it off kilter, but basically I'm going to just put pins right along the princess seam line. And I use this white fabric because I can see through it to make sure I'm pinning in the right place. going to adjust my center front. You may need to play with it a little bit. Don't think because you pinned it down, it's a done deal. Okay, so like if you feel like maybe something got pulled or it's not laying right, take it off and try it again. Okay, but you should have this nice straight line through here. And then, you know, I'm pinning my style line. All right, so you can kind of see the edge of the pattern. This goes up here. And then I also want to pin down here. So I'll start by pinning the center front, lining up with the empire waist. And then I'm just going to pin and right on the line of my empire waist there. So all of this fabric is extra. So just to show you, I'm just going to take all this little bit of extra off, just so you can see. Okay, we're only concerned with what the fabric is doing inside the pins. We don't really care about if it's flopping out to the side like this. Okay, we don't care about this flopping over here. We just want it to be smooth, you know, right inside, inside the piece. Okay, so now that I've got that pinned, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take I'm going to use a ballpoint pen for this, and I'm literally just going to mark the shoulder, you know, and then I'm going to go down the princess seam. And I'm just dashing along. Like that. And then I'm going to dash across like that. And then the other thing I have to mark is my neckline. So I'm just going to mark the edge of my, the bottom edge of my neck like that. So it looks like that. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm just going to look at it straight on here for a second, make sure everything looks nice. All right, so I think I'm happy with that. So I'm going to take this off the dress form and bring it back to the table so we can take a closer look at it. So let's take a close look at this now. There's a few interesting things I want to point out. The first thing is this lower edge here, it's curving down. Now remember, we made that a horizontal balance line that's straight and parallel with the floor, but above, when we're draping from the shoulders down under the bust, it's longer from where the apex is, so it takes more fabric to get from the apex down to the bottom edge than it does at the center front. So that's why there's a slight curve here. I'm going to use my French curve here just to darken that in a little bit, like this. And then I'm gonna darken in where I traced. Because of the size of my bust, because I'm a G cup, it does bow out a little bit at the apex, just a little bit here. So see how it bows out a little bit? And then it almost comes back in slightly like this. Okay, so see the shape that I'm making? And then I'm going to use my little plastic ruler to create the shoulder seam. And then I'm going to go back to creating the neckline. Now, at the very center front, you have to have, I would say, almost an inch of straightaway. You don't want to ever come down at a point like this because you'll make a V shape. Remember, this design continues across the front. So in order for it to look like a round neckline where it kind of goes straight across at center front. So give yourself a little straight across there, and then use your French curve to finish the shape. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly add a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. I'm a little short down here, but I'm not going to worry about it. I'll just trace it through like that. So I'm just marking my 1/2 inch seam allowance. Like that. Then I'm going to use my rotary cutter and I'm going to cut off all this extra fabric. And this will make it easier to drape the next piece because we won't have like an uneven extra amount of fabric. We'll be able to pin it right to the stitching line of this piece. All right, so there's my completed center front. And I'm just going to mark over here, center front. Okay, and then I'm going to put this back on the dress form now. All right, so you should be able to just lay it on the dress form without any pins, and it should stay pretty nicely and even with the style lines that are on your dress form. If you put it on and it's not hanging straight, you may have to revisit your draping. Okay, it may have not been completely accurate. So I am just going to anchor this now, in all the key areas. So at the neckline, along the shoulder, and then across to the apex. Okay, so it should look like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually go back to the cutting board and get our next section of fabric ready to do the side front piece. Now the side front is pretty wide because it goes from the side seam to the apex. That's almost 10 inches, and it's still the same, 15 inches long. So we've got 10 by 15, so we'll add a couple inches to that width measurement. Okay, so let's get our next piece ready. And for the side front piece, I am going to, it's 10 inches, so I'm going to give myself an extra couple of inches and snip it at about 12, like this. Let's give this a tear. And then I'm just going to check and make sure it's on grain, and I'm going to just give it a little press. Okay, for this piece, I'm not going to fold the edge over. I just really need that for the center front and the center back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use my L ruler to create a horizontal balance line to start working with, to line up with the apex and with the one that I drew on the center front. So let me just draw that. So on the center front, the center front edge is our grain line. So to create a grain line for this piece, I'm just going to go in a little bit from the edge, and you can see I'm lining up this side of my L with the horizontal balance line, and on this side I'm just going to go up a little bit to create a grain line. So I have it, and then I'll flip it over and do I'll do this side too. All right, so now I've got a vertical and a horizontal grain line. So let's pin this to the dress form. All right, we're gonna take our second piece of fabric and I am going to line up the horizontal balance line with the horizontal balance line on the center front. I'm gonna pin it there. Okay, and then I'm going to sort of straighten out this, you know, pin this with the rest of this horizontal balance line parallel to the floor. So I'm going to pin across like this, and I'm going to smooth it across like this, and I'm going to put a pin. All right, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start smoothing this way towards the center front. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to go like this. And again, we have fabric that is like too much, so I'm going to just trim a little of this fabric away from my armhole plate, or in my case it's like my shoulder here. And I'm going to clip in like I did around the neckline a little bit. That'll help the fabric lay nicely. Okay, and see how it like helps to create a nice smooth shape. All right, and then when I get it over the shoulder like that, I can see I've got a bunch of extra fabric here, so I'm just going to trim a little bit more away. Like this. And then also see back here, there's a lot of fabric that I don't need. So I am just going to just trim some of that away. Don't get too crazy with your trimming though, because you can trim too much and then you won't have enough fabric to cover the area. So you can see what's happening is the straight grain line is coming in pointing towards the neckline now. And that's because to get this to lay smooth, we have to smooth it this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start pinning, you know, along my princess seam style line here. Okay, and then I can also get rid of some of this fabric now to make it a little bit more reasonable to work with. All right, so I'm just going to smooth that in. You know, and I can also see I don't need these clips aren't even getting anywhere close to my armhole yet, so I'm just going to get rid of those, and I'm going to clip in a little bit deeper just so I can get in there. All right, so now that I've got that clip pretty well, you can see I can get that to lay nice and smooth. See, so the goal is to get it to lay nice and smooth. And then I'm going to pin up here right at the shoulder and princess seam. And we're going to pin along the princess seam. And I'm just going to smooth it out, line it up with my side seam, and then I'm going to pin along the empire waist. I'm going to smooth that right out. We want to get a nice smooth fit underneath this bust. So again, I'm going to clip a little. a little bit in here too. Basically what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pin that right along the empire waist. Like that. And then I'm also going to pin along the armhole. And you really need to just take your time here. Let me cut off some of this extra. We don't need all of this. Yeah. Oh, I think I cut a little bit too close. All right, see, this is why you need to be careful, because I literally cut right to my sewing line right there. You got to be careful when you trim. I trimmed a little bit too close. All right, so now I'm going to pin along my shoulder and down my armhole. All right. All right, so you can see, I think you can see that I'm pinned through here around the armhole, the side seam, the empire waist, and then we have this area in here where there's extra. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure 2 inches above the apex line, like this, and I'm going to draw a green line, and I'm also going to go 2 inches below. But I'm keeping this fabric up here because this is going to have to get eased in. So I'm just going to measure 2 inches below and make a line like that. And then I'm going to transfer that to my center front as well, because we want those to match. So basically you can see what's happening here is we're going to ease in this extra fabric that's hanging out here. We'll gather that up and ease it into the center front. Okay, so that's how that's going to work. So now I'm just going to go ahead and mark my front armhole. My side seam. My empire waist. And then up the princess seam. Okay, so see how I just sort of, you know, dotted on this extra, this loose area here. And then I'm just going to continue straight up to my shoulder. Okay, so there's the draped side front. Let me take that off the form and we'll look at it on the table. Okay, let's look at the shape. You can see that it looks very similar to a princess style line. Pretty happy with it. I'm gonna, again, use my ruler to darken in my lines. Here's the blue. All right, and then I'm going to use the straight edge here. And then we'll draw this in. Okay, And then I'll use my straight edge here. And I'll just put this curved bottom in over here. Okay, so there's my side front. I'll just gonna write here side front. And again, I'm gonna create my 1/2 inch seam allowances. Over here where I took the chunk out, I'll just draw around that. But things like that can happen, so be careful when you're trimming excess fabric out of the way. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. It's easier with less fabric, but on the other hand, if you cut it too close, you know, you end up with little boo-boos like this. All right. All right, let's take this piece and put it back on the dress form. All right, so again, we should be able to put this on without too much fighting. See, I can kind of just lay it there and see how it kind of stays pretty nicely. I'm going to go ahead and pin this one right to the princess line. So basically I'm overlapping seam allowances right now, and I can match my notches, you know, for easing. All right, and I'm just going to put one pin here at the apex. Okay, but see how that looks? Okay, so we have a pretty good fit on our upper side front. All right, so the next, all right, so now we're going to drape the back pieces the exact same way. I already created my center back piece by making a size that was good for the size we have to cover, and I folded the center back edge over 1 inch like I did for the center front. So let's pin this on. And I don't have any horizontal balance lines on here because really it's just going to be a matter of smoothing it out. This is like a big rectangle. So the thing is, I want to make sure I have enough to wrap around to meet the front pieces. So I think I have that. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pin this at the top and at the bottom. If you're watching this, if I had thought about it, I probably would have draped this with you guys first. So if you're watching this process and you're having trouble with the front, try doing the back first because it's a little bit easier because there's no bust. So I apologize that I didn't think of that earlier. But again, I'm going to cut this little triangle off and I'm going to make some clips. So I can smooth that out. So just like the front, I'm smoothing the back neckline out. I'm going to pin it to meet the center front. And then you're just going to smooth it off this way. And I'm going to put a pin at the princess seam line and the empire waistline right here. Again, I'm just following that right down to the waist. And let's just mark all the key areas. Do the neckline. The shoulder seam. And then I'm going to just mark the princess style line. Okay, so it looks like that. You can see that was much easier, and I really didn't have to even cut any extra fabric off. So let's quickly take that off and true that up so we can finish our last piece for the top. And again, make sure you have that straightaway at the center back, because we don't want to create a mini V-neck. All right, so again, we're just going to quickly add those seam allowances, and then I'll cut it off and pin it back on, and we'll get to our last piece. All right, so just like the front, this should just nicely lay in place. You shouldn't have to like do any manipulating to this to get it to hang straight on your dress form if you draped it properly. And I can see that that's fitting really nice with my center front. I mean my front pieces. All right, so that's how that looks. Okay, you can see it's just laying there really nicely. So the last thing we have to do is just drape this side back piece, and we'll be done with our upper sections. All right, so I prepared my piece of fabric by making a horizontal and vertical guidelines just for a visual, just to help me keep straight visually. So I'm gonna pin this fabric on, okay, and where we're pinning now, where we want to have that is, I'm gonna start at the bottom, and I'm going to go all the way to the top, and I'm going to identify that princess seam. And I don't know if you can see through it on the camera, but I can see through it. It's right here. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is trim off this extra fabric around the armhole. Get rid of that. Okay, and I have way too much fabric over here, so I'm going to trim this off too. See, that's an example of if you use a piece that's too big, it's really kind of hard to see what you're doing. So make sure your fabric is, you know, a good size for the shape you're trying to drape. And I'm just going to pin it down here. And I'm going to pin across to my armhole right here. And then I'm going to pin the rest of my shoulder. And just to show you visually what's happening, I'm just going to cut this off. Okay, so you can kind of see what's happening here. And I have way too much fabric. I'm going to just cut off a little more of this so it's not in the way. And then what's really important is, again, I'm going to clip around my armhole. And that'll help me wrap this fabric around. So I've clipped, and we're just going to wrap. I'm just going to pin that to it for a second so I can get rid of a little bit of this extra. All right, and then also I'm going to trim off some of this. There, that'll give me a better size to work with. And I'm basically just repeating what I did on the side front. I'm just smoothing it around and, you know, pinning it to match. I don't need these. Don't need any of this. Now I'm going to mark my back armhole. And I'm just smoothing it around the curve of the back. Now, if you have a custom dress form and you have some significant curvature to your back, this is going to be a little bit more time consuming, and you do need to take your time when you're smoothing it along. All right, so there is the side back piece draped on. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go take it to the cutting table, to our work table, and true this up. All right, so that's the base of my back armhole right there. All right, this is my side back. And I'm going to quickly add my seam allowances and cut it out, and I'll show you how it looks. All right, so let's look at this last piece on the dress form. Okay, so the side back piece basically fit on there really nicely with 4 pins. So that's how that looks. Okay, so we have our center front, side front, side back, center back. I'm going to sew these pieces together, and I'll be right back to show you the finished top section of the cover. So I'll see you back in a minute. All right, I have finished sewing the top or upper bodice pieces together, and you can see that this cover fits really, really well. It's not pinned on at all. And that's a good sign that, you know, you did a good job draping. My lines or style lines in my cover match what I drew on my dress form. So my side seam matches, you know, the princess seam lines match, my center front, my center back match. So I'm really happy with the way that this top of this cover came out. Join me in part 3, and I'll show you how to drape the lower bodice pieces together, and we'll sew them together to get a finished half cover. So again, if you need a refresher, join me for part 3. If you feel like you've got it, there's really going to be nothing new in terms of technique for in part 3, so feel free to join me. And if you feel like you got it, watching part 2, then you're good. Join me in part 4 when I show you how to make paper pattern pieces and fine tune the fit of the cover.